Distinguished guests, excellencies, dear colleagues, dear students of the Geneva Summer School programs. First of all, I would like to extend my very warm welcome to the 380 students coming from all over the world with a wide range of backgrounds and profiles to take part to one of the 15 courses organized by the Geneva Summer School in collaboration with foraus. Thank you very much, foraus, for collaborating with us. It's very important to have your presence here today. The University of Geneva has long played an essential role within International Geneva, based on its expertise, based on its attractiveness of its training and the excellence of its research. Let me remind you that our university is among the top 1% of the best universities in the world, according to the Shanghai ranking, and that it has been awarded recently 2 prestigious prizes, the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2019, attributed to Didier Queloz and Michel Mayor, and the Fields Medal in 2022, attributed to Hugo Duménil-Copin, an award which is in fact a Nobel Prize for mathematics. The collaboration with International Geneva stands also in the middle of our priorities, especially thanks to the Global Studies Institute. Thank you very much, this director, to be with us today, Nicolas Levrin, but also thanks to the Geneva Science Policy Interface and the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator to foster research which are addressing some of the challenges that international organizations and NGOs have to face today. With the multiplication of humanitarian crises, increasing pressure on existing structure of assistance, aid and rescue, International Geneva is increasingly called to play a greater role with prompt result and real impact at the global level and behind its traditional domain. From climate change and biodiversity loss to pandemics and rise of non-communicable diseases, from displaced population and refugees to digital divide and illiteracy, the multi-stakeholder approaches to global governance are proving to be the most adapted and the best way to have impactful responses mechanism. In this context, universities as places of intellectual inquiry, research, exchange, dialogue, and reflection that are increasingly entrusted to play a pivotal role toward agile, innovative, and impactful action. In order to face all these challenges, the University of Geneva and its partners across disciplinary backgrounds and communities have mobilized all resources to assist as we possibly can those affected and in need, but also connect teaching and research with humanitarian action. Our program, called Horizon Academic, that you may know, is a great illustration of how members of our university have pooled resources in a minimum time to assist students and the scientific community in Ukraine and beyond. 300 students' applications have been received, and more than 100 will participate in the Horizon Academic program this year. This program illustrates the university position on the hosting of refugees, regardless of their nationality, their gender, or their origin. We aim fairness in relation to the treatment of the various refugees who arrive at the University of Geneva who come from other regions of the world in crises such as a conflict in Afghanistan, and Iran, or other in Africa. I would like also to mention some other programs that have been developed at the University of Geneva to face the challenges of our world. First of all, the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Action is yet another bridge between our community and the humanitarian action. The center offers a Master of Advanced Studies in Humanitarian Action, which welcomes about 30 people from all over the world. I would like also to mention many activities developed by the center in Afghanistan, such as a study which aims to analyze the impact of attacks on hospitals, translated now to the case of Ukraine. Finally, the research of the center are conducting projects on forced migration in territories in conflict, particularly in Afghanistan, in Tigray, in relation to access to care, including diabetes. I would like also to mention InZone, which is a program of the University of Geneva again, which pioneers innovative approaches to higher education in communities affected by conflict and humanitarian crises, with the ultimate goal of empowering people on the move stranded in transit countries. It gives special attention to refugees and asylum seekers stranded in fragile states, but at the same time foster an inclusive approach, including people on the move more broadly, as well as vulnerable host communities. Established by the Faculty of Translation and Interpretation in 2005, InZone soon gained publicly and was approached by humanitarian actors such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, the United Nations Refugee Agency, Médecins Sans Frontières, or the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. The third program I would like to mention is the Geneva Academy. The Geneva Academy is a joint initiative of the University of Geneva with the Graduate Institute that highlights the fundamental role of international law in ensuring fair and impartial investigation into abuses, crimes, and persecution. As you can imagine, the expertise of the Geneva Academy is particularly essential in the time of a deadly war in Ukraine. The versatility of our university, made up of 9 faculties and 13 inter-faculty centers, the close relation we maintain with numerous academic networks around the world, in particular for EU+, a new alliance that University of Geneva has joined with the University of Sorbonne, University of Heidelberg in Germany, University of Copenhagen in Denmark, University of Milano, Warsaw University, and Prague University. This network, as well as the League of Open Research Universities, where we have 23 of the best universities in Europe that are closely related together, and the close link that bind us to International Geneva are major assets in meeting the challenges that our society will have to face in the future. I would like, again, to thank you very much for being with us, especially our special guest today, and I will give you the floor to the panelists. Thank you very much for your understanding. Thank you.
So, hello. My name is Amani Bathily, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. I'd first like to say a few words about tonight's topic and maybe the format that we chose. I'd first like to say that tonight is actually about you students, you the young, you who are passionate about the intricacies of our world, you who dream of solutions for the problems of tomorrow. Essentially, it's about you, future generations, and future leaders. Now, I remember being about 8 years old, and I was kind of learning about the inequalities of our world, and I woke up from a dream, and I said to my mum, but why don't we all get paid the same? Why don't a doctor and a cleaner get paid the same? Because they work, and essentially they help others. And my mum kind of sarcastically smirked and said, that's called communism, darling. And a few years later, I found myself at university, and I found myself learning about communism, but also learning about the research, the thinkers, the ideologies, and kind of the sheer luck that made our economy what it is today. But I still strived to think of solutions that would make our world more equal. And I can remember being constantly labeled an idealist. And for information, being ideal in international relations is apparently not so ideal. And a few years later, I found myself working in International Geneva. And I kind of put my hopes and dreams for equality aside. I kind of started to focus on the what's, how's, who's of International Geneva. And to be honest, International Geneva is pretty overwhelming. In fact, I'm actually quite surprised that no one has yet developed a dictionary for the acronyms and terms that we use in International Geneva, just so that newbies like me can figure out if the lunch workshop on the annual conference commission called EKMCP on basically just about anything from science, diplomacy, etc., actually makes sense to be figured out. International Geneva titles are pretty long. Now, what I realized is I was trying to fit in. I was trying to figure out the formats. I was trying to conform. I was trying to be realistic. But realistically speaking, I kind of hate to break it to you, but things aren't very good. And actually, they're not looking that much better down the line. We're facing immediate humanitarian crisis, climate change. It's making crisis actually more and more complex and more intertwined. We're facing more and more needs, financial needs, and a gap between the actual resources that we have, making people having to make very difficult choices. So why be realistic in such a bleak world? I hope that tonight you dare to dream. I hope that tonight you dare to ask the naive questions. Because even if my 8-year-old question was naive, I have to say that it was pretty legitimate. So today, I hope you can be idealistic. And this is why we have brought to you the format that we have tonight. We've brought to you the best of the best from International Geneva, and you will have the opportunity to ask the questions and actually exchange. We've given you a lot of time to exchange with panelists, so you'll have time just after Mr. Volker Türk's speech, and you'll have time at the end of the panel. And then, on top of this, you'll have the opportunity to participate in a very, very Swiss tradition called apéro, which will be happening at the 3rd floor, côté parc household, so near the park. Finally, I'd really, really like to say a very, very warm thank you to our panelists for being here. So we have Ambassador Batsheba Crocker, who is a US representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. We have Beatrice Ferrari, who is the Director of International Affairs for the Canton of Geneva. We have Özge Aydogan, who is the SDG Director at UN Geneva. And we have Miren Bengoa, who is the Director of Swiss Solidarity. And finally, I'll open the floor to our keynote speaker, Mr. Volker Türk, who is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to the University of Geneva and to Foraus. I've just learned what an interesting institution you are, and to have a chance to engage with you and to share a number of thoughts with yourselves. It's interesting that you come to Geneva and that the topic is Geneva International or International Geneva. And it's true, if you look at who is present in this town, it is a wide range of people working on humanitarian affairs, on human rights, obviously, but also on technological issues, health, and labor issues. So you have the privilege of studying in a city that prospered by offering refuge to people that fled religious persecution in the 17th century, and where in 1864 Henri Dunant founded the International Committee of the Red Cross out of his experience. And of course, international humanitarian law and international human rights law are very much connected. In addition to the many UN agencies and humanitarian organizations that are based here, Geneva is also an important place for ideas to come together. And I think in particular of a very innovative initiative that was taken by Switzerland on the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, which you may know as CHESTER, those of you who haven't followed that. And it uses, this CHESTER initiative uses the sharp end of some of our generation's most interesting technological advances to tackle fundamental questions and to look into the future. Who are we as humans at a time of so much bioengineered change and so many artificially intelligent devices? How can we all live together? How can we use technology not competitively, but to ensure the well-being of humankind and the sustainable future of our planet? We can reach for a better future when we have come to understand deeply the challenges and lessons of the past. And that's a little bit the theme that I have. And as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I feel this very deeply. My office is just maybe 2 kilometers away in the Paquis. It's headquartered in Geneva. It's the Palais Wilson. It's a historic building. It was once the seat of the League of Nations, which was, as you know, the first worldwide intergovernmental organization that was set up after World War I to maintain world peace. I think we all know that the League of Nations, unfortunately, is not always held in high regard these days, but it may at least stand as a lesson for perseverance. After it failed to live up to hopes, after a second global war, the Holocaust, massive human rights violations, massive displacement in Europe alone, there were 60 million people on the move, states redoubled their efforts and they created the United Nations, and they created a very interesting document that I hope you have all read, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Alongside the UN Charter, this simple, short document, 30 articles, set out the lessons learned from the experience of the cataclysms that happened in the first part of the 20th century. And they wanted, the ones who drafted it, really wanted the world to walk out of mayhem and towards greater prosperity, justice, and peace. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by the way, is in the Guinness Book of Records because it's the most translated document in the world. There's no other document, not any of the holy scripts are as translated, as much as translated as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of this declaration. It was born 75 years ago. And I really, as I said, please read it if you haven't read it yet. And if you have read it, please read it again. It's worth reading it every other week or so because it gives you some clear foundations of who we are. I have to admit also for me personally, I remember when I read it for the first time, I was about 15 years old, and it grabbed my attention and my imagination, and it was really something that I kept my whole life. I still have this old copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I got when I was 15, and I put it up on a wall in my house, and it really inspired me. And inspired me my whole life. So what are human rights? Human rights are a common language of humanity. And you will see that if you read the text. It's a unifying force at the heart of which lies human dignity and the consequent duty of care for other human beings, irrespective of circumstances. We believe that this language that you find in human rights can overcome divisions, polarization, which we have seen have tragically gotten the upper hand of late. This language can also make peace with nature, our planet, and it can point the way to sustainable development for future generations. And let us not forget that this document is not, and I cannot emphasize it enough, is not a Western construct. Sometimes some people want us to believe that. It's absolutely not true. Because it has traditions it has roots in many traditions, was informed by revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. We sometimes forget the Haitian Revolution. It was 219 years ago. It was a revolution against slavery, against colonization, against racism. And it was also drafted as a result by the lobbying of non-Western member states. And I would also like to refer to another anniversary because it's an important one to bear in mind. It was 30 years ago. It was the second World Conference on Human Rights. It took place in Vienna, World Conference on Human Rights organized by the UN. And it happened after the decolonization process, after the end of the Cold War, after the apartheid regime fell in South Africa, and it brought all member states together at the time. It was 171, and they negotiated for 2 years the outcome document of the Vienna Declaration on Program of Action. And in it, you will see the reaffirmation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you will see an end put to the cultural relativism arguments that we often hear today. And I would like everyone to, again, look in particular at para 5 of the Vienna Declaration, because it tells us that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. and that they must be fulfilled in a fair and equal manner on the same footing, and I quote, and with the same emphasis. It's the duty of states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural systems, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So it really put an end to this cultural relativism discussion that has been, unfortunately, holding us back for much too long. But we keep seeing it coming back, so it's good to remember what was agreed painstakingly over many years. This comprehensive view of human rights, it's about civil, it's about political, it's about economic, social, and cultural rights. It's also about the right to development and the right to an environment. It really stems from wisdoms, traditions, thinking that comes from all cultures, from all countries, and from all continents. And I also believe that in it you will find the solutions to a lot of the challenges that we face, because we have a lot of these challenges, and Geneva is a good example of how these challenges are addressed. Peace and security threats, International Geneva has played an important role when it comes precisely to this type of things. Rising inequalities, the backlash that we see against equality for racial and ethnic minorities, the backlash that we see on gender issues, on LGBTIQ+ communities and people. And I want to focus on two challenges that I'm sure are very much in your minds. One is climate change, but also generative artificial intelligence and new technologies more broadly. Let's look at what International Geneva, and particularly young Geneva, can do to meet these challenges. We know about the catastrophic impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, which is this triple planetary crisis. We know how omnipresent these impacts are. We know that no country is spared from its impacts. And in particular, the fulfillment of human rights is of course very much affected by it. And we know how much human rights must be part of the solution. And interestingly, last year, all member states, by consensus, adopted a resolution in the General Assembly, which is a very important step forward, in July last year, almost a year ago, to speak about the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment amid thriving biodiversity and ecosystems. But to protect the environment, we need to end impunity for attacks against environmental human rights defenders. And we have seen of late a tendency, especially for those who belong to indigenous populations. We need to encourage, not beat back, the vital work of climate activists, many of whom, by the way, are young people. We also need to stop the massive financing and subsidization of environmentally destructive industries and get serious about investing in sustainable development. My office will continue to advocate forcefully for a rapid and equitable phase out of fossil fuels and for remedies when it comes to people who have been harmed by climate change. We have COP28 coming up at the end of the year, and it must be successful. We have a very small chance to still meet the target of 1.5 global warming, which becomes, the more we don't take urgent action, less and less of a reality. We also need to make sure that loss and damage are properly financed and addressed, and that we work together on a just transition to an economy that works for people and for the planet. I followed with interest in a number of countries climate litigation cases that people and communities around the world are lodging in national and regional courts. I was just in Austria at the beginning of this month, and I was told about children who have filed a lawsuit in the Constitutional Court alleging that Austria's climate laws fail to protect their rights and those of future generations. And I understand that there are other children around the world who demand much stronger action by governments through the legal system. And the European Court of Human Rights has recently held hearings in its grand chamber, which is really for very important cases, that's when they do that, on two cases in which applicants sued the governments of France and Switzerland. In fact, the one from Switzerland is, I met one of the, she said she's a retired pensioner from Switzerland who was part of that court case. Precisely again, because of inadequate action to protect their human rights from climate change. We also see that other such cases are currently going through the court system. I'm encouraged by these examples because there is a contribution that both international law and national law can make, because they are a driving force in the search for solutions to address the triple planetary crisis. Because we need to make sure that our responses are grounded in the values, in the rule of law, which is part of the heritage of human rights. When it comes to the digital space, we are confronted with lots of things, just to name a few. Generative artificial intelligence. You have heard a lot about it this year. Deepfakes, bioengineering, and they are moving so quickly that government regulations are often hard-pressed to keep up. Of course, it is important to say this technology, if it's used properly, has incredible, enormous potential for the benefit of humanity and for our challenges that we face, because of course technology has always been and will continue to be an incredibly important tool. But if we don't manage it, the implications for our human rights are equally enormous. When we cannot be sure what is true, none of us can feel safe. And we also know that trust is eroded if that happens. Trust in our institutions and trust in each other. And many communities have suffered the real-life impacts of artificial intelligence already now. Just think of policing that happens through facial recognition without sufficient safeguards on the human rights front. We need to make AI work for everyone, and we need to make sure that it is not used deliberately or inadvertently to reinforce discrimination and exclusion. And the only way to achieve this is to actually listen to and seek out, especially those groups, those parts of the population that are particularly affected by tech and its biases. I mean, we know that there are biases against women, for example. We know that there are sometimes biases against communities in the Global South, those living in poverty, marginalized communities, LGBTIQ+ communities as well, and others. So it's important when these things get developed to bear in mind the unintended consequences of prejudice and bias. So they need a lot of care and thoughtfulness, and it's clear that people need to be at the center of it. We have also called on tech companies to ensure privacy and freedom, to provide an open and safe space for individuals and communities to have open debates and to store their private information, which means they must take all lawful measures to resist attempts to disrupt or censor communications on grounds that are incompatible with human rights. So what it is, it's essentially when these things are developed, it's about the regulation, the management, the design, and the use of emerging technologies, and to ensure that there is a human rights due diligence aspect attached to it, and not just at the beginning, but throughout its entire life cycle. These are really important guardrails. So human rights offer important guardrails as a almost sine qua non for technology so that it can help us and serve the common good. We have at the same time, and that's an important aspect as well, the cure must not be worse than the disease. We have seen also, on the other hand, some governments using crackdowns on so-called hate speech or disinformation as cover for censoring or targeting journalists and human rights defenders. So you have the other extreme as well. Or to restrict freedoms and privacy online, or even to shut down the internet entirely. So we will need to work through very carefully the type of regulations that are grounded in human rights. So when we want to address these challenges, we need to pay particular attention to how our actions today can protect and advance the fundamental human rights of young people, but also take into account the rights of future generations. And that's still a debate that has only started. You know, what is it when it comes to intergenerational justice? And let's be frank, I think my generation, but even the generations before me, before us, we are handing over to young people and to future generations a planet that is threatened by catastrophic global warming and ever-increasing natural disasters. And when we look at what we have done in the past to the environment, we realize that we must be good ancestors to future generations. It might be tempting in such an environment to become cynical, to give up in despair, or to assign blame. But I encourage you as young people not to go down that road. And I want to give you two pieces of advice. The first one, I really want to inspire you to political action. So many of the rights and freedoms that we enjoy today, women's rights to vote, labor rights, a lot of things that we take for granted in our daily lives, were born out of social movements. Feminism, the labor movement, LGBTI movement, Black Lives Matter, the climate activism that we have seen. So social movements are drivers of change, and we depend on it to advance for human progress. So please do not give up on politics. Register to vote, vote. Hold your elected officials to account, learn about change in societies, join the debate on issues that you care about, and be creative. We need your fresh eyes in everything that is being done today. I also call on you to reject a binary approach. And there's a good example in the history of this city, because it was President Reagan and Secretary Gorbachev who met in this city. And at the time, this was not taken for granted to actually talk about how to end and come together during the Cold War. They didn't see the world in binary terms, because we know that if one sees the world in binary terms, it closes off route to progress. It cannot be East versus West, global North or global South, men or women. The binary approach is not going to give us the solutions that we need. We know that the issues today are very complex, and we need to be able to engage with everyone who can contribute and who has a voice in the debate. It's your voices. So I'm really glad to be speaking to a university audience, because what you learn is that we all agree on is that we need to debate, and we need to have the open and safe space to advance our common search for solutions, of course, based on facts. And that's important, because we may come to different conclusions and hotly debate them, but we have to agree on the facts and on the evidence. We must categorically reject the ridiculous concept of alternative facts, a phrase that entered public discourse just a few years ago. And that's my second ask. To navigate the present, we also need to learn the lessons from the past and from history. So that's really important. We cannot ignore history. We are not able to deal with today's issues if we don't know your history. And you need to know your history, and you need to know the history of your country, how it fits in the world community, and the history of the world. Because we also see in many places around the world a concerted effort to exploit people's ignorance of history, and even to deliberately keep children, students, and electorates ignorant. Many wars have started because of the lack of historical knowledge, or the perpetuation of fake grievances that came from some of the historical so-called knowledge that was given. And it's really important to be clear about the knowledge and the knowledge of history. And I want to encourage you, as you go forward, to lead the struggle for human rights in the coming decades. So we hope very much that we can count on your individual, but also your collective engagement, but also contributions to the Human Rights 75 initiative that we are leading this year. And there will be, at the end of this year, a big event in Geneva on the 10th, 11th, 12th of December, where we hope that pledges will be made, not just by member states, but also by individuals. And you can think about what it is that you yourself want to contribute to in the human rights cause. When you look at the state of the world, I know that sometimes there is this feeling of frustration, perhaps even hopelessness and cynicism. But I prefer the attitude of Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, the former First Lady of the United States, who in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust played an incredibly important role in drafting the document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I leave you with her words, and I quote, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." So, thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you very much. We'll open the floor for a few questions. Usually the first question, no one puts their hands up, and the last one, everyone wants to ask a question. We don't have that much time, so I recommend you go for it. Yeah. And I don't know who has the microphones. Yeah. So does anyone have a question? Not for our panelists, obviously, for Mr. Volker Türk. Sorry, you can't hear me very well. Okay. Yeah? First question.
Thank you. Since always the first question is needed, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Fadi Daw. I'm the Executive Director of Globe Ethics. It's a small international organization that had offices here in Geneva. I totally agree with you that the declaration is universal. And the process that led to the declaration was universal. However, universal means at that time, in those years between 46, 48, and universal today means something different, because at that time, not all nations, not all countries, not all people were around the table. And 2 days ago in Paris, there were the World Summit on Finance, and this French initiative for a new global finance pact. And it was struck by the voices of the African leaders saying, almost crying, on the world leaders and saying that you are not hearing us, you are not understanding us, we need a new model in this world. I think this applies also to human rights, I'm not putting in question the declaration again itself. Great nations were represented from different blocs. Also, small nations were represented. Sharm el-Sheikh, I have Lebanese origins, and a small country like Lebanon was represented on the table drafting the drafting committee with Sharm el-Sheikh. However, I'm questioning the narrative that was built on this declaration since 48 until today, and the usage that we made of this declaration. That is not really universal. And allow me to take the example of the 2 points that you choose for your presentation. One of them, the AI. We are struggling today to be able to offer online courses because the majority of the humanity still don't have proper access to internet, Yeah. So are very, very far. Governments may have good access, to control their populations, but the world population is very far from this. So I would like to hear your comment on what we did with the declaration since 48 until today. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a question right at the end. And maybe, I apologize, but could you keep it short and to the point, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Bemisola Oshadua, a participant at the Digital Law Summer School and a PhD student here at the University of Geneva. Thank you very much, High Commissioner. I had the privilege to intern with the Office of the High Commissioner between June to December last year, the period we saw your transition into office from High Commissioner Michel Bachelet. And the point I wanted to make is about what the today's discussion started off with, especially also as highlighted by the esteemed moderator, about the whole essence of having the opportunity for young people getting into the field of human rights, into international development at the United Nations. And my point is about the aspect of economic rights, which the United Nations stands for, and the issue of unpaid internship at the United Nations. So in the course of this summer school, I've also had the privilege to interacting with some of our colleagues that came from other jurisdictions and saying that, oh yes, they would really like to be part of International Geneva, to be part of international organizations, to come back even after the summer school. But in terms of the compensation, in terms of payment for interns, this has been an issue that I know has been for a long time. And I recall in the last meeting of the immediate past High Commissioner, I actually raised this and mentioned that asked her that should help us include it in a handing over note to you as you come into office. And I saw that you've also commented on it at some point. So I am also taking this opportunity to reiterate it so as to be able to really bridge that gap in terms of what the United Nations stands for in terms of reward, compensation, and payment for intern in the UN system. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have?
Thank you for your speech. I actually have the question regarding the human rights. I just finished my research on Polish human rights and the situation with abortion in Poland. And I just wanted to ask the question, because Poland lost 12 cases according to violation of human rights. And I wanted to ask how, as young people, can make a difference. How can we take action, not only in Poland, but also like worldwide, to open the eyes of people that don't see what is happening in Poland right now. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe. Should we proceed to?
One more.
Okay, maybe. Okay, one last one. Okay.
Mr. High Commissioner, thank you for the opportunity. I would like to ask you if you personally believe that there will be one day in which every single human right will be respected in every country of this world. Thank you.
It's a good ending question.
Well, let me start with,
Yeah.
you want me to? Look, on the universality, I really would ask you to be very clear about the fact that, first of all nations at the time, in 1948, participated in it, which means all continents. It was, of course, before the decolonization, it was before the, I mean, we still had colonies, so a lot of countries could not participate because they were colonized. And that's important. At the same time, and that's why I was mentioning, whenever they joined the United Nations, in the principles and purposes of the United Nations, you have the promotion and protection of human rights already in the Charter. So it is, if you like, if you assume that responsibility when you want to join the United Nations, you're not forced to join the United Nations, but when you join it, you're bound by its obligations, which includes human rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the main document at the time that set out the vision of the United Nations for human rights. So it was universal. Let's not forget that subsequently you had very important global human rights treaties on civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, discrimination against, elimination of discrimination against women, on racial discrimination, on people living with, on the rights of people with disabilities, child right, I mean the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, you had a subsequent machinery of human rights treaties that defined obligations for states. So it's not just the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the subsequent instruments as well. And then, as I mentioned, you had Vienna. And Vienna reaffirmed the universality. So no one was forced to adopt the consensus document that was negotiated in Vienna. It was adopted because it was felt that this universality was important. And as I said, it took 2 years to negotiate that document. So I would really counter this, which I sometimes hear, well, it was negotiated only by a few states. No, I think we can say today that it's something that is really seen as an acquis in the international legal regime. And it's interesting, in the Human Rights Council, in March, it was one of the few resolutions that got adopted by consensus. So no one puts a doubt on the nature of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's really important, that's why I'm saying read the document, and it will be an eye-opener in many countries around the world, because you will ask yourself, well, does that apply in my country or does it not apply? And how can we make sure that it's finally realized? And that's about the promotion and protection of human rights. So on the technology, yes, the connectivity issue is a human rights issue. The fact that we have still 3 billion of people not connected to the internet is a big issue. And I know that especially ITU, we have an international organization here led by Doreen Bogdan, they work very hard on making sure that there is universal connectivity. I mean, not just her, it's the UN system as a whole. And of course, it's also the private sector. But absolutely, we cannot afford illiteracy on the technological side for almost a third of the world population. That's absolutely critical. But it's not just connectivity, it's also quality behind it. We need to make that sure. We saw that on education. Education sometimes was seen as a, you tick the box, children go to school. It's also about access to quality education, including secondary and tertiary. Look, I agree. I wish we could find a system to make internships pay. I think it's something that I promised we would work on. There are our own rules, which makes it very difficult, but absolutely I agree. We should not have to have a system in place where interns are essentially volunteers. But I can also tell you, when I look at my own financing of the organization, it's actually very difficult to find precisely the funding for it, so we would need to do a special effort on this. And unfortunately, there are a lot of rules around this, which I don't want to bore you with, but I agree, it should be paid. I'm not quite sure I understood. Look, on economic rights, actually what I've discovered when we looked at macroeconomics, and I don't know how many of you are studying economics or have studied economics, I wonder how much you learned about human rights when you studied economics. Many, I understand, are not learning about human rights when they study macroeconomics or business economy. And that's interesting, and we are really trying to make sure that in each and every discipline there is a human rights component in it. Will it ever be fulfilled everywhere? Hope springs eternal. That's the only thing I can say. It depends on you. Thank you very much. And on us, collectively, of course. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think you have to leave us now, but thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Hi.
Bye.
So we can maybe directly start with the gist of the panel. I thought that before we start this roundtable, as I said, I think that many people struggle to actually understand exactly. So, on n'entend pas bien? We can't. Okay. Otherwise, I'll just take a normal mic. Can you hear me better? Yeah? Okay, great. I thought we could just start with a quick round of actually what does your position consist of on a day-to-day basis. Maybe I can start with you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And just checking that the microphone is working. Closer? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be here. And I think, as High Commissioner Türk also said, it is always humbling and I think exceedingly important to have opportunities to engage in different ways with students, with young people, and with future generations. And so I had some prepared remarks, which I might use a little bit, but I think maybe just a little bit more interesting to talk about, as you asked, what does my position entail? So I am the Chief of Mission and the Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. And I will tell you that when I was going through my confirmation process for my job, I saw that those other international organizations numbered anywhere between 45 and 110, depending on whose numbers you agreed with. So it is a vast array of organizations, and I think fair enough to always highlight that it's important for us to figure out ways to talk about what the work here is really about without resorting to acronyms or listing of organizations. We have not too far away from here, the United States mission to the UN here in Geneva. It is the largest US multilateral mission around the world. We have about 300 people working at the US mission. And I say that not because that's an interesting number in and of itself, but because I think it gives a little bit of an indication of how robustly the US engages across all of the work here in International Geneva, and also just the sheer breadth of the work that is done here. The High Commissioner mentioned some of that work, but it is obviously human rights, it's humanitarian work, it's intellectual property, it's trade, it's disarmament, it's labor rights. I mean, on the humanitarian side, you have the confluence of having the High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization on Migration here, so it's a particular focus on forced displacement. There's the World Meteorological Organization, there's the UN Disaster Risk Reduction outfit. So we also have a lot of climate change work that actually goes on here in Geneva. It's not normally thought of as being a locus of climate change work, but really there is a lot that happens here. We have a lot of development work that also happens here, and obviously we're all engaged, especially this year as we head toward the Sustainable Development Goals Summit in New York in September on the SDGs, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. So I won't go too much into that, but there's an enormous amount of very important development actors here in the Geneva landscape as well. So my role is to represent the United States across all of these, almost all of these organizations. We have actually 4 ambassadors representing the United States here in Geneva. And I am the Chief of Mission, so part of my role, and I think it's always important to highlight this because it's always useful when you think about what's coming next in your own careers and lives. A big part of my role is just management. And making sure that everybody at the mission understands how their role contributes to our overall priorities, strategies, and objectives here as the United States, leveraging the fact that we do engage across all of these different venues. So where can we understand how an issue is playing out in one venue and what that's going to mean for how we might expect it to play out in another venue. And by the way, I forgot a huge amount of the work that is here in International Geneva, which is obviously all of the global health work, where, among other things, we're deeply engaged at the moment as we are coming out of the COVID pandemic in negotiating what is being called the pandemic instrument or the pandemic treaty, but is looking at a new international instrument so that we are hopefully better set up the next time we do face a global pandemic. So it's helping to sort of understand how we're engaging across, where we can leverage work that is being done in one place for how it's likely to come up in another place, understanding sort of what our overarching priorities and strategies are and how all of us in our different ways fit into that. International Geneva can feel very siloed. Sometimes you think like, okay, my job is to represent the United States at the UN Economic Commission for Europe or at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and that's really where your focus might be on a day-to-day basis, but I try to help make sure we're lifting up our gaze and understanding, well, if we're dealing with the issue related to, say, Russia Russia's invasion of Ukraine there. It's also an issue we're probably likely to face in another place, and how are we going to deal with it and understand how actors are dealing with it in one space and then therefore what we're likely to face in another. We have a huge emphasis as the United States on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, both in terms of our internal work at the mission, and that's part of my role as manager, but also in terms of how we engage in all of the work across International Geneva, so how gender issues are playing all across, I mean, of course, in the human rights space, but really we are facing issues related to gender, related to the rights of LGBTQI+ individuals, related to sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, inclusion, all across the piece. And so my days can be sometimes a little bit too technical and boring, but most of the time fascinating. I'm learning stuff all the time, and I can have a day where I have a breakfast with diplomatic counterparts where we might be talking about humanitarian issues or the latest humanitarian crisis that we're facing, and then deal with human rights issues, and then maybe go to a lunch on intellectual property, and then maybe I'm dealing with something in the International Labor Conference that just wrapped up last week. And so it's a lot of, you know, we are, those of us who serve in this role for our respective countries are kind of hopping from issue to issue a lot of the time. But we also do try to find space to make sure that we're engaging in the right ways, both with our usual partners and like-mindeds, as we call them, but also finding ways to engage across regional groups and engage with new and different partners and really form the kinds of relationships that will sustain and that are going to make the difference as to whether we can get things actually negotiated and agreed in the way of international agreements or resolutions or decisions in a particular context. And that means that we need to do more than just pick up the phone and make a particular ask when we have a particular vote that we're trying to whip around a Human Rights Council resolution or an International Labor Organization resolution, but that we're actually finding things that we can work on together and break down both silos across agencies, but also our tendency as member states to sometimes be stuck a little bit in our own corners when we come into conversations.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but I will have to insist on the time because there's quite a lot that we want to go through, and we'll be able to delve more into your roles also as we advance. So, Beatrice Ferrari, what does a Director of International Affairs for Canton do?
Well, first of all, I take the opportunity to wish a very warm welcome to all the incoming students. Welcome to Geneva. I'm representing here the Canton Geneva, so in our federal and very decentralized system in Switzerland that would represent more or less a region or a province in other countries. And I'm closely working also with my colleagues from the city, which is down there as well. I'm in charge of international affairs here for the Canton of Geneva, so we take care of anything that has to do with international relation, let's say, for the canton. But I would like also to mention, and maybe you notice yourself, that Geneva is a region that is extremely international. One would not necessarily think about Switzerland, you know, of being that kind of very open platform. Sometimes we are portrayed as an island in the middle of something, Europe, but we are actually a hub. And Geneva in particular, in Geneva we have more than 40% population that is foreign, and probably most of the rest of the population has some kind of foreign origin or second passport or whatever. So it's very open, and as the High Commissioner mentioned before, we have also a long tradition in welcoming also refugee. He mentioned the refugees coming from the persecution, religious persecution 500 years ago. But that's something that probably stayed in our history and also in our way to deal with the international, in our responsibility. The International Committee for the Red Cross was created here, that was mentioned as well, but there's something that is staying. The local parliament, for example, voted 20 years ago that we should invest part of our budget in international cooperation project, so that is something that we are managing in my office. And also we are very engaged in facilitating the presence of all the stakeholders that are composing this international Geneva, be it the permanent mission, be it the international organization or the NGOs.
Great, thank you. Özge, over to you. You have
It works like this?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks for having us, the lab. I really appreciate it also on behalf of my team. An interesting question you're asking, my role. I also had something prepared, but to be honest, thinking about it, I would say a change maker. At least I'm trying. I am the director of the SDG Lab. It's a multi-stakeholder innovation space that is or sits within the United Nations Geneva office. It's part of the Directors General office, so I guess in that capacity, I'm also sort of a main sustainability innovation advisor to the representative of the Secretary General here in Geneva. But honestly, in that role, what am I doing? I mean, I'm trying again, the ambassador touched upon the responsibilities of a manager, making sure that my team can do the work that it needs to do. And what is that work? It's really about pushing the boundaries, asking questions, of course, making progress on the SDGs as a multi-stakeholder platform. I also need to mention that the International Institute for Sustainable Development is an institution partner of the lab. So we are really also trying to be sort of that new phase of multilateralism open, because I can imagine there was a question on the internship. I was expecting maybe also to say, how do you get into the UN? Because it can be at times a black box, but really opening up, because multilateralism is something that we don't own as the United Nations. It's something that we share as a common space. So that's really, I guess, the role I have. And also really trying to critically think about sustainability. I guess as a chief sustainability person, I can say that. What do we mean by sustainability? What is it that we want to sustain? And what is it really that we are trying to go into in terms of, and maybe just closing on that, the High Commissioner said it, as good ancestors, what is it that we're leaving behind? And I think all the work we're doing on sustainability, of course, it's about, you know, meeting our needs. But if you go back into the very core definition of sustainable development, and for those who like history, I'm just adding another one onto your list, check out the Brundtland Report, 1987, if I'm not mistaken. I went behind the books today, and you see, I mean, you look at the definition, it's really about, again, meeting our needs, but not sacrificing, compromising the needs of those to come. So that's really our role. How we do it, I'll explain a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Miren, Bengoa, over to you.
Yes. Well, I'm very happy to be here. First and foremost, say thank you to Foraus and to University of Geneva for having me. And to say that one of the things that strikes me today is this all-female panel. I have to congratulate the organizers for that. It's so rare these days. But also that embodies something that I want to testify on, is the fact that women are taking up leadership roles in diplomacy, in state affairs, in philanthropy, which is what I represent today, also in communication and so many other ways of innovating through sustainable means. And I think that's a powerful message to all participants. So I myself have just recently, a year and a half ago, taken over being the director of Swiss Solidarity Foundation, which bears very different names in Switzerland because we are a multilingual country. In majority Francophone areas, we are called Chaîne du Bonheur. Chaîne du Bonheur is the chain of happiness. It was built as a radio show back in the 40s, right after the Second World War. And it really stemmed from the Swiss Public Broadcasting Agency, SSR, to become a means to call on Swiss citizens each and every time a disaster strikes. And we are still today, 2023, acting as the main humanitarian platform for private donations in Switzerland. So I feel very honored myself to be leading a team of 25 people. It's very little compared to many other large foundations out there. But our role is to activate campaigns, making sure that whenever there is a humanitarian situation that is, of course, spoken about in the media, and it's one of our caveats that when under-mediatized crises are under protracted crises are happening, it is harder for us to activate public generosity. But we are still working on that. And so we tend to garner a lot of support from private donors, philanthropies, also from corporates now, but working hand in hand with multilaterals on how to operate these funds through civil society, Swiss NGOs in particular, but also through local networks, in a nutshell.
Thank you. Great. So I thought, as I said, you will have the opportunity to exchange a little bit of the content. We kind of described International Geneva a bit as this black box. So I just wondered, show of hands, how many international organizations and NGOs do you think International Geneva encompasses? A, 18 international organizations and 280 NGOs. You can put your hand up if you think that's the answer. No? No one? One person? Okay. Courageous. B, 43 international organizations and 750 NGOs. Who thinks it's here? Okay. More going for B for now. And C, 27 international organizations and 450 NGOs. Okay, so we're more than half and half. Okay. So the answer is is B. International Geneva regroups 43 international organizations and approximately 750 NGOs. This actually includes 32,000 international civil servants, diplomats and representatives of the civil society, more than 4,700 annual visits of heads of states and government, ministers and other dignitaries, more than 4,000 conferences per year, organized face-to-face or in hybrid events, and approximately 366,000 delegates from around the world. So for a pretty small country, it's quite impressive. And so maybe over to you, Beatrice Ferrari. As we said, okay, International Geneva is a bit described as this black box, but what is its role, and maybe what are the challenges to come, the types of crisis that we've been discussing? What are they?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot of people. It's always good to look at the numbers to remember that it's really an ecosystem. We like to call it like this because it's made of different stakeholders. You didn't include in those numbers the academia, which you are representing today, which is also bringing minds and brains to this international cooperation ecosystem. We like to call it like this because it's many different stakeholders that are here working together. There are silos, as the ambassador mentioned before. There are many different silos, but also areas of collaboration that are existing. Beyond the organizations themselves, something that struck me also when I started in this job is the level of expertise and engagement. There are incredible people working in all this, in this whole ecosystem. It's really people who know a lot about international issues, but also who are incredibly engaged and having values. I think that is something also that we should not forget about values. I think the High Commissioner reminded us about the Declaration of Human Rights, but it's in general is about what kind of values do we want to put forward in this international system. And there are a few challenges. I mean, of course, we are living in a time where crises are coming. There are more and more crises. They are lasting longer. Many of those crises are not finishing. Someone from the International Committee from the Red Cross told me last week that they stay usually, on average, 36 years in a country for an organization that is meant to, come and help at the beginning of the crisis and then leave. And that means that we are entering a phase since a long time where we have all those crises overlapping and everyone is concerned. That is also something that the High Commissioner mentioned. We are all concerned. It's not something happening out there. So we need solutions. And we need places of discussions. This is something happening in Geneva. Sometimes you have very high-level meetings that are public. Sometimes you have things that are not visible, that are happening here, that are still happening, even though it's a challenge. How do we find neutral place those days to discuss? Where do we find safe places where we can address difficult issues in international cooperation? And that is something that we try really to preserve in Geneva, but it's not easy. It was built as an idea. It was mentioned also before 160 years ago, the first Geneva Convention was signed. It was also the idea of a man who could not accept the situation that he saw on the warfield, and he pushed forward that idea, but many other ideas came after that. It's not easy as a place of solution. There are many challenges, there are many failures as well, let's face it. There are many discussions that don't get progress, but still it's a place where we can find ways to cooperate, ways to discuss, ways to bring a lot of different stakeholders around the table, and I think we really need that these days.
Thank you. You mentioned the question of actually we need these places for exchanges and essentially for multilateralism. And I was wondering, with kind of geopolitical tensions also kind of flaring up and things getting harder, more complex, I think I'm going to ask this question to you, Ambassador Crocker. What is the responsibility of member states to preserve multilateralism?
So thank you for directing this question to me, and I was heartened to hear the High Commissioner, when he was talking, mention the words obligation and responsibility in the remarks that he gave. I mean, I think it goes without question that all of us as member states do have a responsibility to preserve multilateralism. We also all benefit from it, right? But we have all signed up to it in different ways, and with that comes obligations. Now, it is fair enough to say that we do not always agree, and in fact we often disagree maybe on a lot of different things in the multilateral system, and in fact it was a system that ultimately, you know, at its core was set up to enable us to have difficult conversations in a sort of constructed and therefore hopefully constructive space or set of spaces, and we certainly see that play out across multilateral Geneva. You know, there are different ways in which the fundamentals of the UN Charter are being deeply threatened by the ongoing crises around the world that we've been touching on. And we certainly believe that it is incumbent on all of us, and certainly a priority for us as the United States, to protect and defend and stand up for the UN Charter. And that's why you see us taking actions across all of international Geneva, but across the multilateral system more broadly, to stand up for the Charter and to make sure that those who seek to violate it explicitly are held to account. I do think that it's important in the context of, as you said, increasing geopolitical tensions, to remember that there are very practical ways in which the system is still delivering. And I wrote down a few of them so I would remember the details. But I think it always helps me to be reminded, as I am from time to time, about just how consequential the system is, and the kinds of the scale and the kinds of things that it can deliver on. So, for example, just last week, after 20 years of negotiations, you think 2 years of negotiations of the Vienna Declaration was tough, but after 20 years of negotiations, the High Seas Treaty, which is also known by its very complex UN name of the Agreement on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, was adopted at the UN. It will importantly create, for the first time, a coordinated approach to establishing marine protected areas on the high seas. And this is seen as a critical step, among other things, in the international community's efforts to reach the 30 by 30 target, which is to conserve at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. So obviously the health of the ocean is something that we're all thinking about in different ways as we think about the different elements of the climate crisis. And again, it's a treaty that took us 20 years to negotiate, but it will actually deliver results. Another example, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which has its secretariat here in Geneva, it's an independent public-private partnership. It's a multilateral funding mechanism, and it aims to expand global access to and use of vaccines, particularly among vulnerable children. It was launched in 2000. Since that time, it has dispersed over $18 billion to support immunization efforts in low and middle income countries around the world, and that's not including the COVID-related vaccination program. Because of this program, 1/8 of humanity has now been vaccinated, over 1 billion children. This has led to a 70% reduction in vaccine-preventable disease deaths and a 50% drop in mortality for children under 5 years old. This is not an insignificant accomplishment by any stretch of the imagination. It's not the same as the conversations that go on, and as we were just describing, are sometimes difficult and sometimes lead to failure. But I do think, as we think about glimmers of hope, and as we think about why we continue to need this system in the context of climate change, in the context of global health, in the context of the forced displacement crisis around the world, that the system still can deliver. Again, sometimes it takes a long time, but still can deliver at a really kind of unprecedented scale and in ways that we need it to deliver if we're going to be able to deliver on the SDGs, among other things.
I don't know if anyone would like to answer or jump on that. No? Then maybe, yeah, you can go on to... On the question of glimmers of hope when it comes to multilateralism, show of hands, how many of you think that geopolitical tensions and is threatening multilateralism? Yeah? Okay. So probably half-half. Interesting. Okay. Therefore, maybe moving on, I was actually wondering, because Miren, Bengoa, you carry kind of a very different role, where politically you kind of stay clear from politics, but simultaneously you're at the heart of multilateralism. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that and why that's important for Swiss solidarity and its role in International Geneva and dealing with crisis.
Well, the first thing we always mention and claim is that we abide by the humanitarian principles, which are independence, humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. And of course, it's always a difficult task finding your ways into humanitarian interventions, applying all those principles at once in a perfectly transparent way. The recent crisis of 2022 have really shown the limits of deciding to intervene against odds, and we know it's not the first or the last crisis that we face, whereby just by intervening, just by saying we will provide assistance to the population of Ukraine, most obviously, was in a way taking sides. So to avoid those criticisms, which are absolutely legitimate, we have made sure that all the funding that we received for the population of Ukraine or the people affected by the war in Ukraine, was the definition, would be available for projects wherever they could take place based on proposals by NGOs. So we did manage to get a couple projects running even across the border of the Donbass, which indeed is not an easy task nowadays. But having that particular case in mind, we also know that most disasters will strike people absolutely indiscriminately, and it is our role as a humanitarian actor to be coordinating with all the other humanitarian actors. And in that sense, we will be striving for coordination at local level, and making sure that the aid that we will fund and provide will be relevant in a given context, making sure that we take part in all the coordination mechanisms through the NGOs that we will fund. And of course, we rely a lot on others making a big deal of the work, which is the humanitarian diplomacy. ensuring that we can gain access to those remote and hard-to-reach locations, which in some circumstances are held by rebel groups or are under no governmental control. So access to victims is absolutely crucial, but also ensuring the security of humanitarian actors. And that cannot be necessarily guaranteed in places like even Somalia these days, or northern Kenya. I was meant to go on a field mission early April to visit some of the interventions fighting food insecurity in northern Kenya, but our trip was shattered from one day to the next because of insecurity in those regions. So there are many factors that lead us to always make decisions based on the 4 principles I mentioned, but essentially by how can we relieve and avoid human suffering wherever we have access, and that is definitely our motto.
Thank you. For me, something that's striking is that humanitarian, obviously, help is something that's immediate and kind of reactive. And simultaneously, I find that the question of multilateralism is kind of a very present and in-place solution. But I was wondering with your work, Özge, Aydogan, is actually, are there more preventative methods and approaches to crisis?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Amani. I mean, I would like to start off maybe first of all acknowledging, of course, the need to respond. I mean, I worked for many years for UNICEF, which, for those who know the organization, always is very proud of having this double heads, humanitarian developments, and there's this famous notion of the nexus. So acknowledging the need to respond to humanitarian immediate crisis, of course, it's extremely important, and I guess we see that also reflected in some of the numbers shifting, for those who are also interested in development finance, numbers that are going more towards humanitarian, coming obviously from a more developmental, to a certain extent, pot, so to speak. So that's for sure a fact. But again, myself, I'm more of a development practitioner, if I may say, with a humanitarian experience, but more looking at it from a long-term perspective. And I think that's really what I'm trying to say, I guess, at this point. So while it's important to think about the crisis and how we respond most effectively, saving lives and you know, all of that, which is incredibly important and key, it's also extremely important to not lose the big picture out of mind and to think long-term. Because otherwise, honestly, what's going to happen, and you see it already happening, we will keep on being trapped in a vicious cycle of responding and reacting and responding and reacting, and never really be able to sort of go beyond that. You mentioned, Ambassador, the SDGs. I mean, when they were adopted in 2015, of course, there was this idea of 2030, and I guess it also, I mean, thinking of it as a political commitment, you have to have certain goals in mind, that maybe a deadline to be able to at least psychologically make progress towards that deadline, but by no means, obviously, is that agenda going to be finished by 2030. There's no expiration date to that. It's more a motivational point of we are working towards that, and I think that's really important to just keep in mind, because ultimately, and also super frank about this, I mean, the SDGs, we have nothing better than the SDGs at this point in time, and I think if we had to renegotiate a treaty at this point again, you know, at the level of the SDGs, I'm not 100% sure, and for those who have worked in intergovernmental spaces, I've also used to work for the Swiss Foreign Service for a while, I don't really see it happening. So really have to be very careful what we are, you know, protecting, safeguarding, and it is, I mean, the SDGs as a framework, they're a blueprint for a more inclusive, peaceful society, and there's even, as a framework, obviously, because it's interconnected, what we're addressing here is a complex problem, but there's even a specific goal, SDG 16, that specifies that. So just on that, and I guess, I mean, thinking about it now, well, yes, we are doing kind of two things at the same time, right? We are thinking about the more short term. We are trying to sort of fight fire, so to speak, but we're also thinking which is the house that we are going to build that is going to be probably much more safe against fires, if that makes sense. And I think that duality is often quite tricky, and maybe last but not least, just from an SDG lab perspective, so how do we do that at the lab? For those who know us, probably you associate us with building bridges. Yes, we have been quite extensively working on finance as an SDG enabler, also data and digitalization. But right now we are in a quite exciting moment of, at least I feel it's exciting. I think my team as well, I speak on behalf of them, but in a strategic reorientation process precisely to actually say it's about SDGs and long-term sustainability, because again, there's no expiration date to it. And how do we do that? You're looking at it really from complementary lenses, and I mean, in addition to the SDGs, I would like to maybe mention also one reference point that has been, I believe, pointed at, which is our common agenda, right? It is really a turbo booster for the SDGs, and when you look into the common agenda, there are quite some really interesting ideas and concepts there, and that actually defines what we also, to a certain extent, label as new lenses of sustainability. So it's by no means, replacing, but how can we make the SDGs stronger as we are working towards what we call, for the sake of a different or better, maybe lack of a better word, SDGs++, right? The legacy that we are trying also to build beyond 2030. And these three lenses are going beyond, so beyond GDP, but also moving towards new sustainability paradigms. I mean, I personally believe the next sustainability paradigm will be regeneration. So how can we as societies move towards that? That again will help to build societies that are much more resilient, which then, obviously will lead to the fact that we have to probably do less of firefighting moving forward. We talked about it again, and I'm very passionate about this, future generations. Yes, about young people. All of you, I'm not that young anymore. I look quite young, but I'm not. My advantage though. But really, what is our footprint? What is it, intergenerationally speaking, in terms of the fairness and solidarity that we're passing on? And again, the commissioner, High Commission mentioned that. I strongly believe, I'm a foresight practitioner myself, strategic foresight. If you think from the perspective of those yet to come, and you backtrack from that point of view, you imagine yourself, you're born in 2050, how would you design systems from that point of view? Which brings me to my third point, the work around culture, emotions, and behavior, which we kind of sum up as affective science. Why is that? Because honestly, I mean, you ask us about the roles that we have, but we are all humans after all. That's what we are, I guess. And in this very critical decade of action, what we really need is to activate each of us to do more and better for the SDGs. Because again, I mean, it is this responsibility to pass on what we have honestly received from our ancestors to those to come. And I strongly believe that, this is really a way to basically be much more aligned with the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals, and eventually again, create societies. And that's sorry, I wanted to say that, I should have said it before, but Beatrice, you pointed out at that, which I really think it's a critical point. It's really time we start thinking how we unlearn, learn again, and redesign societies and systems, economic and others, around values that are aligned with humans and the planet. And I think that's a good starting point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So redesigning systems, economics. I was wondering, does anyone want to bounce back on this, or no? I see you laughing, so maybe no. Maybe on the question then of, if I retake your metaphor of building a house that also is resistant to fire, Miren, Bengoa, is there possibilities of doing that in the field, the humanitarian field, of thinking of ways that are more sustainable?
Well, as a practitioner, I definitely believe so. I worked for over 15 years in international development and realized that every single symptom that we were trying to treat, I was in public health, had a root cause that was built in culture, that was built in status of women, status of minorities in a given context, and that all these inequalities could not be fought individually. You had to look at it from the broader perspective. So moving now, let's say, forward into dealing with complex crises, obviously we cannot look at one crisis and find a solution. How can you rebuild the Turkey and Syria region that has now been destroyed? Over 150 cities were affected by the earthquake in a night, overnight. It's not going to happen. Ukraine, it will take over 10 years at least to build the most basic infrastructure back, even with all the best investment and the best possible private companies coming in. So we need to look at the resilience factor that is built inside communities. And I trust that even when we go in and out of a country with immediate assistance, looking at what is missing right now to the population, and of course supporting local governments and local civil society in doing so, we should never be a replacement. And I think that is one of the key messages that I'm trying to pull into everything we do, is that we're not doing things on behalf of others. We are just supporting them in their rebuilding capacity. But it's obviously not that easy in an architecture of humanitarian assistance, which just last week during a very large conference called the Grand Bargain, which has been repeating itself since 2016, since Istanbul, isn't that ironic, has been saying the same thing. Basically, trust local actors that they can get the funding directly to implement the change or the reconstruction that they need. Well, it's actually the hardest thing ever, is trickling that money all the way down to where it's most needed. Because if we look at the figures today, and I'm always coming back to my Ukrainian example because it's so daunting how much funding we received last year at every level of our capacity, but so many other institutions received a huge amount of donations, because we were thinking that by helping financially, it would solve the issue. And we obviously hear 1 year after that it's obviously so much more around the conflict resolution mechanisms that things might actually see the end of the tunnel. But rebuilding Ukraine will not happen without the local investment, and that comes with talent, that comes with avoiding the brain drain also, and not necessarily giving no hope back for return for all the people who have fled in the immediacy of the conflict. And just because the figure really struck me is that even with all the millions that have been poured into that one context, over 98% of the actual response is conducted by volunteers and by local NGOs, and we have to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Since we've talked about the question of kind of immediate response, and we've gone through this idea of more like a proactive vision, if we think of a vision of a future world, and the world is to come, there is a big topic, and I've got a question for all of you here. You can maybe, yeah, no, that was for, thank you. Is actually, do you think that there is a fair balance between Western and global self-representation within international Geneva? So, yes, you can put your hand up. Wow, okay. And no, you can put your hand up. Okay, so quite a clear response on this one. So Ambassador Crocker, I'm headed towards you with this question, is how can Western nations actually become more aware and conscious in the way that they include Southern voices within multilateralism in general?
I mean, I will say at the outset that I think the question presupposes that somehow there's some, that it is up to Western nations to give others a voice. Now, it is true that there has historically been different power dynamics, I will say, within all of the UN system, including here in Geneva. And it is one that is increasingly being bristled against. We have had some of that already come out in the context of this discussion. The United Nations ultimately was built on the premise of, it was built on a sort of a duality. On the one hand, universality of membership, and on the other hand, a system of values and principles that underpin the system. And those two things are sometimes at great odds, and we have been finding that, I would say, especially recently in the context of addressing Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that means for the system. But ultimately, every member state has a seat at the table. Now, some of the organizations, not every member state is represented for different reasons. And obviously that looks different if you're talking about an organ of the United Nations like the UN Security Council. But if you look at the UN General Assembly or the universal membership organizations here in Geneva, that's what you certainly find. And I think really, what is incumbent on all of us, and certainly is a huge part of what we consider to be our job here as the US mission, is understanding how we can develop what I was talking about earlier, which are the kinds of sustained relationships across regional groups, north to south, east to west, however you want to slice it, that will mean that when we get down to negotiating things in our various venues, we are able to move beyond our stock standard national positions that we may bring into any discussion, or even a regional group position or a position that is based on sort of like-mindeds or a transatlantic position or what have you. That is not always easy to facilitate, and there's also an inherent imbalance in the sense that I talked about the strength of the US mission here. There are some member states that cannot afford to have any representation in Geneva. Or if they do have representation in Geneva, it's very small. There are some missions here that are 1 or 2 people. And when you think back to these numbers of organizations that we've been talking about and that were on the screen, you can understand how for missions that are very small, it is exceedingly difficult, and I would say really impossible to engage robustly in every conversation that goes on here. And that's where the groupings that grow up across the multilateral system, be they regional or otherwise, start to make a lot more sense even just from an administrative perspective. But while they serve very useful functions and amplifying functions, they can also tend to reinforce strongly held positions. And we've been talking a little bit about how do you create safe spaces, and I think ultimately that's why we're here as diplomats, right? That's what our job is as diplomats. And when we succeed at it, it is by virtue of very, long and concerted hours that are put into forming interpersonal relationships that give you the ability when you need to try to break through strongly held positions that otherwise would disable you from getting to agreement on these really important issues that we're talking about.
Great. Maybe because we're running out a little bit of time, so maybe on a question of the future, I was just wondering, Beatrice Ferrari, where do you see International Geneva in 2050?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know, to be honest. It depends if you ask me what I wish for International Geneva or what I see or what other threats. Let's stay on a positive note. What I wish for sure is that we can preserve this space, as I mentioned before, this kind of safe space for discussion. I'm still totally convinced that we need institution for international governance. We need places where we can discuss, exchange, find solution. We talked about, humanitarian aid and the number of crises. Actually, we need diplomacy to avoid this crisis or to solve them in a way that is more rapid. So we need this discussion. So that's something that I wish that we can preserve some kind of space, that we can make it also more inclusive. You were talking about southern, western, northern. I'm not sure that this division is the main division nowadays. I mean, the lines of fragmentation in our world, including within our own societies, can be found anywhere. So we need ways to be inclusive in the way, in geographical terms, in generational terms, in kind of stakeholders, to have different voices around the table, from science, from local government, from anticipation, from civil society, everywhere. So we need to have this kind of inclusion. So that's something I think we need to work on. I don't know what kind of form we have the international organization of the future. Maybe they need some reforms, maybe they will adapt. I'm still hopeful that they are nowadays still able to deliver, was mentioned before, but that will also take up really the task to reform themselves and be apt to solve the issues that we have all in common nowadays.
So maybe on the finalization of the topic of hope, Özge, Aydogan, is there hope for the 2030 agenda?
Well, I'm a pragmatic optimist. I mean, in my professional capacity, I have to be an optimist, but my partner knows it's not always easy in my personal capacity. But listen, actually, I took this book just because after we spoke, I mean, for those who don't know it, it's called The Book of Hope. It's by Jane Goodall. It's quite interesting. I was reading it a bit, and actually, she says one of the questions she's asked the most, or has been asked the most in her life, that she has really dedicated to creating a better future for people, planet, and animals, obviously, right, given her activism. It's precisely that. You know, do you have hope for us, for our children, for the children of our children, for future generations? And she says wholeheartedly, yes, but if we act now. And I think that's really the message I want to pass on here. Why I'm saying this. I guess if I hadn't had hope, I wouldn't be here tonight with you guys, and I'm looking at my notes. To be honest, I'm not going to tell you that things are great, and it's been said already by the panel. We are in deep trouble, it is what it is, and I think those that are to come, and young people, you including, you're going to inherit an even more challenging planet, and you have to make life out of that. But at the same time, I think there is a certain issue around how we frame certain narratives, if that makes sense. So when you look up the media, or when you look up, if you need newspapers, which I still do with my old sense of liking to touch paper, but electronic, whatever, a lot of the headlines you see is negative, right? I mean, if it's not the climate crisis, it's AI going rock. If it's not AI going rock, it's poverty levels, inequality going, skyrocketing. It's people drowning in the Mediterranean. I mean, as far as we are concerned here in Europe, honestly, I really struggle to find any positive news. This is what it is. And I think we have had, other exchanges with young people as part of the lab in other occasions, in other universities. And one of the key messages I've always heard and people are sharing with us is there's a lot of hopelessness. And I'm quite sure I speak to you when I say that. I speak really here to you as a human. And what I'm refusing to say, though, is I refuse to accept the future as something that is already baked, as a probable future where there's nothing to be done. Again, we are solving challenges that are increasingly becoming complex, but we are solving them. And I'm sure you've seen it, when you talk about the SDGs. Honestly, also at the UN, it's a lot about safe or rescuing, SDGs on a life threat. I refuse to speak about the SDGs this way. We are working on them. You're working on a quite challenging topic, and the issue that concerns me, yes, is time, because I did talk about systems change, and I'm very, honest about this. It's not about fixing what we have, it's really reinventing something new, because honestly, we have reached boundaries that we can't stretch anymore, and none of us can. So it's really about finding ways to build constructive hope, and I think that's, when you look at, and I would like to maybe end on that note, it's quite interesting, we have been having exchanges with a researcher that has been doing research on emotions for 50 years. And I say this maybe, and somebody heard that already, so sorry for the repetition, but I was so impressed by that. But she says, she's a psychologist, she says, when you look at the type of inaction, because it is inaction that certain types of emotion trigger, guess what? It's fear. I mean, I think by promoting fear, we are not getting the activation that we need to progress on the SDGs. Again, of course, as a UN person, that's my everyday bed and brother, but honestly, it's an agenda owned by anyone. So I'm wondering, can we adopt, by being pragmatic, by being realistic, but can we adopt, a lens where we look at the future as something that can be shaped, where we have still a certain agency? I think that's really quite critical. And I think for that, on your point on inclusion, I couldn't agree more. Just reinforcing what Beatrice said, we have to think about it in geographic terms and intergeneration terms as well. Whose future are we talking about? Please, I have a 3-year-old daughter. I mean, I'm motivated by the fact that she's here, but it's her future I'm trying to also make better, if that makes sense. So I think that's really critical in this debate. And last but not least for Geneva, and that's maybe the concluding thought, honestly, we are really privileged. For those people who had lived and worked in the field, the Commission mentioned Haiti. I actually served in Haiti a while back after the earthquake, and I was quite upset about a very, small issue. And I remember one of the Haitian colleagues telling me, she said, "What is your issue? You have a Swiss passport. You can exit this context whenever you want. I will be stuck in this forever." And I think this notion of privilege, it also comes again with obligation. It comes with a duty, an obligation actually to mix ingredients that we have, and we have it. We have the solutions, we have the actors, we have the courage, we have the in German you say the hard blood. It's a bit strong, but I believe in it. We have all the ingredients to make really a fantastic meal. We have to just, walk the talk. That's what we need to do together. Thank you.
So on this splendid conclusion, we're going to pass on to questions. We've got to start you off, and because I know it always takes time to start the first question, I've got a question here already.
Hi, my name is Debbie.
Oh, I heard a noise. Okay, so the sound is off. Okay, well, yeah. Okay, does anyone have a question until, I see one question at the back here. Edu? Sorry, we've got a question right at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Colin McDougall-Hunter. I'm an ex-UN, and I'd like to thank so much Mrs. Aydogan for her passion, for her wise words, and I'd just like to throw a very large brick in your lily pond. And it is basically a question I'm going to ask you. Some of you won't like it, but I'm sorry. It goes back to the question the gentleman asked the High Commissioner. Do you ever believe that there will be 100% human rights respected in the world? Okay, he could hardly say no. But I'm asking you, why doesn't anybody talk about, other than talking about, I made a list of sustainability and SDGs and UN charters and values and human rights and all that, why doesn't anybody talking about corruption? Corruption is one of the elements. I have lived in the field for the UN for 30 years. Some of these countries don't even have primary care, let alone elementary schools. No wonder there's migration, there's nothing to do. How do you raise a kid with nothing, with no job, nothing? And the second element is, why don't you mention hypocrisy? Because to have corruption working nicely, it's like a tango. You need the corruptor and the corruptee. So I just asked that question. Sorry about the waves.
Is the question addressed to a particular speaker or in general? Okay, great, thank you. Does anyone want to tackle? Okay, it's just maybe for information, Ambassador will have to leave at 8 o'clock. So if you have any questions directly to her, maybe it'd be good if you go first. Does anyone know? Okay, so any questions? One here.
Hello, my name is Hannah, and I'm actually a student at University of California. So my question is directed to Ambassador Crocker. So going back to what High Commissioner Volker Türk mentioned, he said a piece of advice for the younger generation is to learn from past lessons and take that onto the future. And so I guess my question is, what is something that comes to mind for you specifically in regards to lessons we can learn from the US's past?
So, I mean, off the top of my head, I could probably name a lot of different things. But I think I'll talk, I'll maybe use it to close on something, which is And it's not unrelated to the question that was asked in the back either about sort of the hypocrisy and the question related to are we ever going to reach 100% human rights for everyone around the world, which is something that I think you will hear us anyway talk about a lot, and it's the fact that none of us is perfect, neither as human beings nor as countries. And one of the things that we try to do and strive to do as the United States is to be open and honest about our record, to understand where we still have things to work on, and we do, and to open ourselves to others coming in to look at those things and to make recommendations and reports on us. And so if we take the human rights example, we, when the Biden administration came into office, issued a standing invitation to all of the special rapporteurs and special mandate holders that come out of the human rights system to come into the United States. Those reports are not always easy to digest or to receive. But it is critically important, we think, that all of us, and particularly those of us who are democracies, lead the way on being willing to take the criticism, take the judgment, take the recommendations, have a dialogue around that, and not close ourselves off. And you would not be unsurprised to understand the degree to which there is an effort by some member states across the system to ensure that nothing is ever raised and nothing is ever said about them. And if that's the way we're going to operate, we're never going to get anywhere close to 100%, for every person in every country around the world. I hate to say that my answer to that would be, I don't think we ever will get there, but I think we can get a lot closer than we are now. But part of that is going to be all of us recommitting to engaging in and investing in the system, even when that means that we have to face some difficult truths about ourselves. And that's certainly something that we have tried to do and continue to try to do as the United States, and I think it is a point of pride for all of us who represent the United States here in the human rights system and otherwise. And because I do have to leave, I'm going to just also bogart the mic, as we say, to just leave you with one other thought, which is you hear a lot when you are students and young people. You hear a lot from the likes of us who have done a lot to mess up the world, or at least not fix the world, that now you're going to inherit all of this. And I have my colleague Meg here, who has heard me tell this story a few different times, but going all the way back to my 4th grade teacher, and this was during the time when there was a real threat of nuclear war. It was the height of the Cold War, and she used to stand up in front of the class every day and basically tell us that the world was a complete mess, that there was a danger of nuclear war, and that basically, sorry kids, but you're going to have to deal with this. And I got so traumatized by this that I faked my mom that I had a stomach ache for 3 weeks so that I didn't have to go to school. But somehow I credit her a little bit with inspiring me to engage in the world, but all of which is to say, hold us accountable. And let's hold each other accountable. And all of us are global citizens, and we all have a responsibility to engage in the world, to be accountable to each other, and to hold each other to account. And we have to continue to do that. So yes, there are going to be problems that you will inherit and future generations will inherit. But in the meantime, there is a system that is in place that we need to work better to address the problems of today and the problems that we know are coming tomorrow. And in order to do that, we're going to need all of us to be engaged on the basis of actual facts, to have opinions on things, and to hold each other to account, and to make sure that when we have responsibilities as members of the international community, that we are not shirking those responsibilities, at least not doing so without being held to account. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us. Okay, so we are really running out of time, so I'll give space for maybe 2 free questions. Yeah?
Hey, my question goes to Ms. Aydogan of what you said about that fear trigger humans to freeze or even react in an aggressive way. So I was wondering, how else can you trigger change or a new way of thinking concerning the SDGs, if not by fear?
Yeah. Could you repeat? Sorry.
You were mentioning the psychologist who said that fear tend that humans to freeze instead of react in a responsive way. So I was wondering, how else could you trigger change for a new way of thinking except by fear?
I don't have a mic. Yeah. Thanks. Well, thanks for your question. I guess the point I was trying to say or make was that, at least again, as far as I am concerned, and that research is concerned, is when you're too afraid that you tend to paralyze. You see that quite a lot in the nature world where animals just freeze, right? And then there's nothing that they're doing to basically go away. Honestly, at the same time, a certain level of fear is good, because also it activates you. But I think what is important is, again, that we don't think of the future, and I said it before, as something that is already done and baked in. I mean, I personally get very much activated by enthusiasm. I mean, thank you for the gentleman up there, he did mention passion. That's why I'm here, because I am passionate about this cause, and I feel together we can make a difference. So I'm trying to find ways to really, activate that passion in me as a positive driver for change on the psychological level. Now, how do I do that? There was also talk about movements. I believe what this is also about building movements, to be honest. I think, I know among young people that diverts a bit from the issue, but you will see why I'm saying it. There's a huge mental health crisis obviously happening. I mean, COVID, again, the climate crisis, all of it compounding. And there's often a sense, I guess, also of feeling alone and loneliness. But in fact, there's so many people that feel quite the same way, and I think it's important to connect to each other. And again, to see, and again, the commissioner said it, revolutions, I'm not saying that we're going to have revolution, don't please quote me on this one, but I mean, movements and change comes through collective action, if that makes sense. And I think it's important that we're reminded of that, and that we don't just accept things as they're being told, in a sense, if that resonates with you. But I fully get it. I mean, I was where you guys are now 14 years ago. I mean, not in this city, in a different city. We talked about with Beatrice, in a place where actually different thinking was not as much encouraged also. And some people that know where I studied, I'm not going to tell you what I was, but people in Switzerland know that there's another institution that also does international affairs on the other side of this country. And we actually visited the place a few weeks ago, and one of my colleagues asked me, she said, what did change for you? And I said, honestly, not much. I've been always true to myself. It's about learning. But again, I think we have a responsibility to really reimagine what could be. And the last thing I'm leaving you also in terms of a thought, think of, for example, of mobility as an example, right? When you ask kids how mobility could look like, I mean, it depends obviously on the age, but not all of them come up with a car or a bus or a train, because their brain isn't conditioned that way. They really come up with really interesting and quite different ideas. And I think that's the way how we have to think, really. We have to think, what is it when we talk about the SDGs? And again, as a broader agenda goes way beyond 2030, I probably, honestly, whatever we're creating now, I won't see it in my lifetime. I will be probably dead by then. But it doesn't matter, because it's about building a legacy. And I think it's a bit really activating also that imagination in you as humans to say, okay, this is how we can do it. And you will go off once you're graduated in your different, positions and duties or whatever. Take that spirit with you. And from that perspective, from that point that you are, try to be that, beacon of change. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to end here. But thank you very much for being here tonight. And there's the apéro upstairs if you want to continue on this conversation and how to essentially be good ancestors. Thank you.